to welcome you to the third talk in a series of seminars about human rights. Raoul Wallenberg Talks is arranged by Raoul Wallenberg Institute and attitude meetings with the kind support from Sparbanksstiftelsen Finn and Sten Olssons Stiftelse. Today's keynote speaker is Martin Lundsted from V-Dem, and V-Dem is a world's largest democracy research project. And Martin is here to give us an insight in what we know today about the state of democracy. And for those of you who are watching online, please write your questions to Martin and the other participants in the chat window below your video. Now please, welcome Martin.
Thank you. So I'm here to talk about the decline of democracy around the world, and just to give you an idea of the state of the world today. This is from the end of 2021 in our last year's democracy report at V-Dem, and it shows the bluer shades shows different extents of democracy, the red shades shows different extent of autocracy in the world. Now this map would have looked a lot different in 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and what you could say basically is that from the middle of the 1970s up until 2010 or so, the world became increasingly democratic, especially so in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union, where a number of countries democratized. At its peak, it was 72 countries at the end of the 1990s. Now, today, we see a very different trend. We see freedom of expression and association being limited and repressed in many countries around the world. We see polarization and a demonization of the opposition being increasingly common, not least by governments, not just political movements. We also see disinformation growing, especially with new technological capacities and communication utilities. And in some countries, we also see that this has gone beyond infringing rights and demonizing opponents. They've also, governments that is, started to attack elections and essentially assuring that election cannot no longer be lost. So here is just another idea of the state of the world today. It shows the last 50 years. The red line is the share of the world population living in autocratizing countries. The blue line is the share of people living in democratizing countries. And in 2021, 36% of the world population lives in countries that are becoming less democratic. That is to be compared with 3% who live in countries that are becoming more democratic. These 36% are about 2.8 billion people. And as you see, most of this change occurs in the last 10 years. And for instance, during the 1990s, the pattern is very much reversed. So, to just name a couple of other insights from our democracy report, we also see that when you look at the global mean, like what the level of democracy that a global mean person would have, we see that it's gone down to the levels last seen in 1989. So from a global perspective, the last 30 years has essentially been eradicated. Now, I'm just going to say a few words about what I mean when I say autocratization, because it's probably a new term to some. It's also been called democratic backsliding and democratic erosion. It is essentially a process when a country becomes substantially less democratic. So this can also occur in a country who does not become an autocracy. Brazil was an example of this. Under the leadership of Jair Bolsonaro, they have autocratized. They remain a democracy. So it doesn't mean they have to become an autocracy, although that is usually the outcome. The second thing that's important to take account of with autocratization is that it doesn't suggest any way or form in which the autocratization unfolds. Anything that makes it less democratic is an autocratization. And this is important because the way that autocratization occurs has changed quite a lot in recent times. So there are two things that stand out with contemporary autocratization. The first is that that it's carried through by leaders who are elected. So at least initially, they have substantial popular support. The second thing is that it is gradual. It takes often several years to occur. Now, often one thing that people brings to mind when I say this with them being elected is that that has happened before. Of course, there are two very famous examples with Hitler and Mussolini. That was rare then. It remained rare up until about 20 years ago, but it still happened. But a big difference is that once they got into power, the autocratization was swift. Democracy was dead as soon as they got hold of power. That is not the case today, which also means that autocratization can be stopped because it is a prolonged process. So one good example of this modern contemporary autocratization is Hungary. And this shows a graph of the Liberal Democracy Index, which we at V-Dem have. It shows 100 years. Right now you don't have to look at all those 100 years, you can just look at the right-hand side of that graph. And in the last 20 years, you see a substantial decline, right? But it is also fairly slow. And this started, as you'll know, with the election of Viktor Orban, re-election, because he was Prime Minister between 1998 and 2002 as well, but he got into government with his new party, Fidesz. And they started to repress certain media outlets, certain civil society organizations, certain important members of the opposition. They did this not in a very open way. They didn't just jail everyone they didn't like, for instance. This was a process that took years, and especially they used parliament to a large extent to do this, legislation. They did it within some kind of framework of rule of law still, to essentially circumscribe any critical voices, to control information being spread in Hungary, and to ensure that important critical actors could not oppose the government. So they have, for instance, enacted media laws that ensures that if you write critically about the government, you're likely to be fined, you might even be jailed if you do it repeatedly. They have a media supervisory authority, which obviously just is a propaganda organization. But that, again, it took them years to do this. It did not happen overnight, and it was not an attempt to do it overnight, because especially if you're a part of the EU, you're going to get a whole lot of people who get very angry and view the government very illegitimate if you just arrange a coup. So there are a number of problems they face with doing that. This, however, has been much more difficult to criticize, and the EU has been very late with doing that. Today, Hungary cannot really be considered a democracy anymore. It has gone that far. And just recently, this fall, even the European Parliament acknowledged that by labeling Hungary an electoral autocracy. So it took 10 years or so for this process to be fulfilled, and now it's more or less impossible for Orban not to win an election. And this process, which we see in a number of countries in the last years, a number of these 33 countries that are currently autocratizing, we see it in Venezuela, or saw it, that process is finished, so to speak. We saw it in Russia, in the United States, in India, in Poland, in Brazil, in Serbia, Turkey. You can name a bunch of examples. And this is very different from how countries used to autocratize, how they used to cease to be a democracy. The common thing before the end of the Cold War, was either a foreign invasion or a coup. Now, obviously, this ended democracy basically overnight. It just died, and a new leader took place, and often disbanded parliament and things like that as well. They might have fired all the people working in the courts, etc. You basically start a whole new government and regime. And this, two examples that can be used for this to contrast is Chile in 1973. Augusto Pinochet took power via military coup. Another than an example of a foreign invasion is Norway during World War II. So the blue line here is Chile, right? Yes, Chile, thank you. The blue line here is Chile, the green line here is Norway. As you can see, the line just falls off a cliff in 1 year. It is very dissimilar to the way Hungary is autocratized. And I think this is very important to keep in mind, because I think that when people think about a country ceasing to be a democracy, we still tend to think about it in this way, that one action or a few actions or events cause a major downfall or a major change in the way that a country is governed, and not least by whom it is governed. So a classic example of this would be, a more well-known example, is Julius Caesar's coup against the Roman Republic, right? Where it's, in the popular narrative, the popular retelling of it, it is the fate of the Roman Republic is sealed by one action. It is Caesar crossing the Rubicon with his army. That is not how autocratization looks today. So as one prominent scholar on democracy, Larry Diamond, his name, has put it, today's autocratizers, it is as if they're crossing Rubicon in a fog. We don't know exactly, we can't pinpoint a single event or a single action that led to this. We cannot say at what point in time they actually crossed over into becoming an autocracy. So it's a very protected, very gradual process, and it is deliberately so. I'll get to that in a minute. Now, we can generally say that this autocratization sequence, this contemporary autocratization sequence, takes place in 3 general steps. The first step, which occurs before the downfall, before any actual autocratization has happened in terms of any media being restricted, any changes in the electoral process, anything like that, before 2010 in Hungary. And that is that you see a growing discontent with the mainstream political parties and, to some extent, also democracy as a political regime, as the democracy being a legitimate way of ruling. This has, should I put it? I'll put it like this. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. No, but the thing with it is that you usually see this coming out of, that's the thing that's very difficult to generalize, that was why I stopped. This discontent comes from very different things depending on the country. This is what is difficult to generalize. It can be financial crisis, it can be inequality, it can be migration, it can be changes in communication devices, it can be cultural transformations. This is very difficult to say why specifically that sort of discontent arose in that specific country. There you cannot generalize as easily. But it is usually those types of broader changes over time and very dramatic events, such as the financial crisis can be, that leads to this discontent that's growing. And that discontent can very easily be fueled by outsiders, political movements who are anti-democratic. So, and we've seen this in a number of, for instance, studies with citizen surveys on public opinion, that people are growing more discontent with democracy as a political system. There are more people answering yes to the question of whether they prefer a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with elections related to having a democracy. And also the level is high. It's like, for instance, I think it's 1 in 5 in the US, for instance, and that's completely anti-democratic opinion, right? We also see a number of other indicators that kind of fits into this narrative. We have a lower level of party identification, lower levels of trust in public institutions, lower level of voter turnout in many countries, and also a larger electoral support for non-mainstream parties. These things in themselves are absolutely not anti-democratic, and there's a number of reasons you could, for instance, lower your trust in public institutions that has nothing to do with you wanting to abandon democracy. But put together with the fact that more people are also having anti-democratic attitudes, and as we'll get to, also more people voting for explicitly anti-democratic parties, many people have kind of connected these things, saying that they're part of the same bigger story. And this brings us to the second step. You have this discontent, right? It has been growing. This is the perfect situation for political outsiders, movements who can come in and kind of channelize all this discontent and blaming all the mainstream parties and winning a lot of support based on that. So these are very often, for that reason, populist parties. And you're aware of many of this wave of populism, I think everyone has recognized to a large extent. We've seen it in Europe, obviously, but especially in these autocratizing countries, for instance, like Serbia, Turkey, Hungary, India, Brazil. We have populist far-right movements. They're very anti-democratic. They use a narrative and a rhetoric that focuses on certain issues that tend to be divisive. They use polarization and disinformation to fuel this debate and distort it, making it hostile so that you essentially can't have a reasonable public debate anymore. So they focus usually on things like migrants, ethnicity, gender relations, identity issues, things like that. And that kind of bogs down the whole public debate. And also, what you get with this is a situation where essentially there's very little that the mainstream political parties can do about this. They get trapped in a situation where either they refuse to kind of reflect their rhetoric and their narrative, but then they seem alienating voters who care about it, or they answer it and then they kind of confirm their worldview. So this has been a major problem for a lot of mainstream political parties. On the other hand, it should also be said, of course, that a lot of these populist parties are not anti-democratic. That is important to say. So there's especially in terms of like Europe, like the Five Star Movement in Italy, that's not an anti-democratic movement. So not all populist parties should be viewed as anti-democratic. But most of the anti-democratic ones are populist. So to see how this polarization and disinformation kind of works, we see here are 5 autocratizing countries. And the red line signifies democracy. The other 3 lines are 3 different indicators of polarization. Now, what happens, as you see, is that polarization has increased substantially during these episodes. And it usually does so before democracy goes down, right? So they are very effective at doing this early, and once they are in power, they continue to do it. And this brings us to the 3rd stage. I'll just show you this. These are the top 10 autocratizing countries in the world in 2021. We have countries like Brazil, Poland, India, countries I mentioned, Turkey as well. The only one here that that doesn't fit this narrative that I've put up here with these 3 stages is Mali, which was a coup. And you see this gradual thing. Now, what happens in this 3rd stage that has happened in all of these countries is that this anti-democratic political movement gets into government. They get elected. What do they start doing? Well, they do essentially the same thing that Viktor Orban did in Hungary. They start to restrict civil society. They start to attack media. They further incite polarization. This is a very effective way of doing it, especially because, in part, you want to keep any dissenters, any opposition out and down. But what you also do is when you incite polarization and further disinformation, especially when you have these enhanced capacities from controlling the media, controlling the government, is also that you can start to create a narrative where you legitimize further restrictions in the democratic rule. You can even be open about it to some extent, because you're doing it to keep that kind of evil opposition or that evil minority at bay. You need to keep them out because they're a threat to the nation or the government or the political project that they're doing. So it's a very effective way of doing it. And that is also partly why they try to control media and civil society first, so that stands unchallenged. And that's a way of legitimizing further infringements on democracy. The final thing that happens, and this only happens if it's gone on long enough. Brazil is an example where Bolsonaro lost this fall, so that's one we wouldn't argue that it's gone all the way in this 3rd step, but it is that you start to actually undermine the elections. This has happened, for instance, in Turkey, where the electoral autonomy is non-existent, more or less. The government and AKP, Erdogan's party, completely control the way that elections are run, and should they feel the need, they can manipulate it very easily. And once you get to this stage, I mean, democracy can, to some extent, still be saved, but if they start to control elections as well, it is very hard. And when that doesn't happen, a good example of when an autocratizing leader failed to do this is Donald Trump. He did not manage to control the electoral management sufficiently, partly because it's such a heterogeneous country with, each state has its own system, etc., etc. But because he did not manage to do that, he chose another tactic: delegitimize the elections. That's also fairly efficient. Tell them that it's rigged by the other side, and if I lose, it's because, deep state or whatever didn't want me to win. So, and this, to some extent, you could argue also happened in Brazil, even though Jair Bolsonaro eventually let go of power. He said a month before the election that he would never accept a defeat and things like that. So that's also a strategy we've been starting to see when you don't manage to control the electoral authorities. But if you do, democracy is likely to end. And that is the final part. And for instance, in Hungary, that took 8 to 10 years. Same amount of time in Turkey, for instance. That is probably the amount it would have taken in Brazil. So it's a very protracted process. And kind of in closing, I want to say that even though coups and foreign invasions still occur, of course, Ukraine or Myanmar last year, things like that, so it's still a threat to democracy. This long-term, gradual thing is the most common now. And you can see signs of it long before that party or that leader gets into government. You can also see all actions once they're in government heading that way. But there is a long time before that ends up into an autocracy, which also gives a long amount of time for people to try and do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. So, why is this happening at this specific point in history?
Yeah, that is what earlier what I referred to when it's very difficult to generalize. Basically, people are not, scholars are not, there's no single answer here. There's not even a few good answers, especially because any theory you would suggest, someone could just throw you a case in your face that says, well, it didn't happen here. Like, that didn't happen in Poland, so that cannot be true. But the world is complex, so that's fine. You need multiple explanations. What I think is, one core thing is that it is connected to people being dissatisfied. So they are dissatisfied with something in general. These people are elected. There's things, if you had a more material turn, you'd argue that it's because of inequality, things like that, financial crises, the Eurozone crises, for instance. If you're more inclined to cultural issues, you'd argue that it's because of changes in migration waves, in terms of how we communicate with social media, things like that. Probably the two most common things you hear is social media and inequality. So if you want to say something, those two are very common.
What about inspiration? Because this works in certain ways. You start with some things and you add certain, and you grab the election at the last point. Mm-hmm. Is this inspiration like a dictator's playbook that people copy? And is that a reason why we see it multiplying as well?
Yes, I think so. The first two very clear examples of this are Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and Vladimir Putin in Russia. And those are in the early 2000s, 20 years ago. And they were both very effective. Now, Chavez isn't there anymore, but his party is, Maduro is, and Putin is obviously still there. So it has worked. And what especially worked is that people didn't start to really care or notice. And, once they started to care and notice, they had already secured the power. The country was already an autocracy, more or less. So I think that there's definitely diffusion in that sense, that people are copying because it worked, yes.
Could you tell us a bit about how you at V-Dem measure these things?
Yes, so I can just say very briefly, all the data and all our estimates are based on country experts, a number of country experts from each country that we ask them a fixed set of questions which they can grade, for instance, the extent of judicial independence in this country, how independent are the courts. And then we process this with a number of statistical techniques, which we will not go into here, but the thing is, basically, what I want to say especially is that I have not touched this data. So I have nothing to do with the country scores, and it's the country experts that bring the information, and those are experts living in the countries. So it's not people from Western universities coding in China, for instance.
And there's a lot of people working with.
Yeah, 4,000 people.
Yeah.
So yes.
So if we see this development as clearly as we see it now, do we know what works if we want to stop it?
Well, the one good example is South Korea. South Korea started to autocratize in the early 2010s with I'm blanking on her name, but she was very corrupt and started to amass power for her and her party in very much the same ways as we see for a couple of years. Then she was exposed in a number of corruption scandals. This is done through the media that was still independent enough to do this, at a great risk to them, I should say. That got a lot of people very upset. There was huge demonstrations for months, especially in Seoul, in South Korea, which eventually led courts to indict her and parliament to unseat her. And there are like 3 different types of accountability we can talk about here. It's partly it's the media and civil society who can they can scrutinize and they can criticize. They can engage the population more widely with demonstrations, how they vote in elections, things like that. The third thing, and that is important, which is, for instance, very important in the United States, is what usually called horizontal accountability, but parliaments and courts. They can be very effective in stopping, for instance, when someone proposes illegal ends to term limits of how long a president should sit, which Putin has done and everyone has done, Trump would have wanted to do. They can stop that if they're strong. If they're weak, they can't.
And that means, I guess, that civil protests, when you see the first signs, must be the front line of stopping this, because it's harder for the institutions to act when it's just things on social media.
Yes, definitely. Protest is, of course, a very effective way of showing discontent. As you see now, Iran now, for instance, during this fall, it is very effective both in democracies and in autocracies. So that is one way of really pushing governments and also other institutions into acting.
Well, thank you. And now I would like to welcome our next guest, Susanna Salamanova, to the stage. Welcome. So thank you for joining with very short notice. You're the director of the Europe office at the Wallenberg Institute, and as you may know, the Wallenberg Institute is an academic institution based here in Lund and operating from Lund that promotes human rights through knowledge. Now, Susanna, you have experience from working in and working with institutions in states where that's hard to say, democratic. I'm glad I don't have your space is shrinking. Now, do you have any examples or tendencies affecting your work in wider Europe that kind of relates to the picture that Martin was showing?
Indeed. I couldn't find any country we work with, I mean, mostly with wider Europe region, which is now in the spotlight for many reasons, as we know. But I think where you start, we stop, or where you stop, we start in a way, because we work in difficult contexts. What it means is that those are the countries which are really in this hybrid regime kind of scale, not democratic. and we try to find some insights or some kind of entry points where we actually can plant a seed towards democratization. But what you mentioned, and these tendencies, just move to that, is indeed something what we observe. It's not only in more established democracies, but also in the world we work, like we are at, mostly countries like Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, Western Balkans, where you see three main factors I might highlight. One of them is polarization, as you mentioned. It's extremely toxic political culture, and also it influences the citizens, obviously. They don't have trust, and they didn't have it even before in the institutions that much. There is increasing level of informal sphere of intervention. So people even don't go to election because they don't believe that that's actually a change maker. And we see that in many countries of this scope. What it makes also is an impossibility to create some collaboration towards change, because change is systemic. And for that, especially in complex setups as human rights promotion, you need to have buy-in from broader society. And that's not happening if you have coalitions fighting each other. The number two is, as mentioned also here, increased geopolitical interference. And there, maybe one thing to mention is also EU is losing soft power. Also for the factors mentioned here, Hungary and Poland. So countries which are maybe approximating in the EU, like candidate status, Western Balkans, there's certain fatigue of the EU enlargement. They don't see a buy-in, they even call it stabulocracies, which is a countries which formally agree with kind of the EU accession process, but in practice, you don't see it happening, because also the power is somewhere else. We see it also in the example of Georgia, which used to be a good example of country accessing, approximating EU, and now the space is really shrinking, polarization increasing, culturally toxic, and you cannot find partners to collaborate. I was in Tbilisi a few weeks ago, and it's really difficult to find entry point for our engagement there. And the other last part here is like generally the shrinking space. So one thing is physical, that you even cannot find actors to work with. I mean, because they are contrasting each other, they're not going to work together, they don't have legitimacy, not only governments, but also civil society. It's increasingly difficult. It's not only because of foreign interference, as we know, NGO laws, like foreign actors laws, which are, according to the playbook of Russia introduced earlier, but it's also because people don't trust. They think it's a donor kind of darling, which actually makes money only for someone else. So there's no connection between civil society and actual population. So, and then the other thing mentioned here, more like democracy losing maybe their legitimacy as such, we also see in the subcategory maybe of human rights itself. There are more national interests, security interests, especially in this region, which are taking precedent, like prominence, and people think that those should be addressed first, then we can discuss human rights.
Now we see such a fast development. Has that changed your work?
Yes, it is, of course. I think this is quite unprecedented, at least what worked before, and as we said, we worked 3 decades in difficult environments. We cannot apply the same playbook, because also playbook on the other side has changed. So we need to be really innovative. So maybe 3 things to mention here. One, increased collaboration. We are known as an institute to provide neutral platform for dialogue on human rights. So that was where we could make a difference in very difficult environments. Now we need to enforce it even more, but also with different actors. What it means is, for example, in our work in Armenia, somewhere in between this scale, is that when we try to enforce cooperation between academics and civil society to produce some suggestions for policy level governments to take. So, but you really need to enforce it quite strongly with contracts, with grants, with like conditioning of events, that this is the only way we are going to work together. The other thing is also inventing new actors. One factor of this polarization is also lack of systemic work and strategic look to human rights promotion. Many initiatives are fragmented because people work only themselves, they don't cooperate. But for the long-term perspective, that's where democracy and human rights needs to be strengthened. You need to find some anchor where actually you can continuously work over the years. Now we are revisiting where actually we can work as an academic institutions and academic partners more, stressing their societal role, like how they can actually help societal needs to be addressed. It's not easy, in some contexts it might not be possible, but that's one thing to think about. The last thing for these innovations can be thinking beyond their bubbles. Many times, many of these countries are grouped in some sub-regional kind of compositions. We used to operate with the term of Eastern Partnership, which is like artificial term created 10 years ago by the EU for countries of Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and South Caucasus countries of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. Now, if you look at this and thinking of regional cooperation, some of them are complete dictatorships, some of them are restricted by war, and some others are struggling to kind of find a path in between, and it's hugely geopolitically influenced, of course, with Russia. So we need to kind of think that, and the same thing in Western Balkans, those countries have been grouped within Western Balkans sub-region for a long time, like also with accession to the EU, and sometimes they're already tired of discussing these issues, and many times they have also deeply rooted maybe like some antagonism between each other. So we actually are thinking, can we bring these two regions together and exchange their experience? Especially right now, if you have this, some of the Eastern European countries getting a candidate status of the EU, maybe that can refresh this fatigue of Western Balkan countries, which actually been already for 10 years a candidate status, but they cannot move more. So bringing fresh perspectives from different contexts can actually revitalize some of the processes.
And now, of course, we have the war in Ukraine, brutal war in Ukraine, this massive humanity crisis as an effect of it. We have an energy crisis in Europe. How does this affect the development? And that's a question for both of you. War in Ukraine.
Should I start? I think it has firstly, it has revived the idea that, democracies end through foreign invasions too, because it was a long time ago that it did in this part of the world. So that's one major thing, that the foreign influence is not just through diplomacy and economy and things like that. The other thing that is drawn attention to, however, is also that the diplomacy and the economic ties that countries have to primarily China and Russia, and what they managed to do with that. And this was a big deal at least 10, 15 years ago too, and has been, but it has been exacerbated by that invasion, because it shows kind of one risk of not complying, essentially, with these very powerful, very big states. So that is probably the main thing I think it has changed in the debate with academics and so on.
Yeah. So, anything?
There are Ukraine and war is externality which also internalized. If you think about countries, many of these in our region that we deal with, they actually have direct impact with refugees, both Russian and Ukrainian, coming to their countries and destabilizing them. But also with more like xenophobic kind of attitudes, also interventions in the political sphere. Some of these, it's more diplomacy, not conflict in this case, but it also have a conflict implication. If you think about frozen conflicts in this region, let's say Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which was brokered like by Russia, now it's again revitalized more, also because Russia has some other interests and is distracted. So it's also introducing new players in this geopolitical playground, such as Iran or Turkey. So it's really complex environment, and the EU losing some soft power, even though maybe now with Ukraine many countries joined kind of like the initiative, as we saw from Moldova, partly also Georgia. It's still not won on that side.
And what's your view about where America is at this very moment? We have a failed coup, and we have a Republican Party that haven't really decided who they're going to lean on, and how would you describe the current situation?
I mean, positive in the way that it has withstood two elections after this, you could call it a major stress test, basically, on the democracy, and has managed to hold two elections that have worked, all in all. That is very good. There's also been some degree of counter-reaction to the very anti-democratic aspects of the Republican Party, and it looks now like at least the most extreme versions of that Republican Party is losing and will probably not be as prominent in the presidential election and the Senate election that year as well. However, doesn't mean, or it doesn't seem like the Republican Party will, in terms of their views and acceptance of democracy, will return to where they were 10, maybe 15 years ago. So it's still a very different party, and they still constitute a big threat. And especially the discontent that brought Trump to power and made so many people vote for him again are still there, basically. That has not been solved. It might have mobilized people on the other side, but a lot of people are still very displeased.
Does this, the development in America, does this affect the countries that you're working with?
Not in the short term. We don't see that much, because in this region, especially Ukraine, we can see strong involvement of the US, always been. So in this way, it's a bit of revitalization of Cold War, and maybe also before that, the US was trying to look into China kind of as a counterbalance. Now it's coming back to this region. So we actually see some more interest in the US to securing the institutions and democratic developments in a way they could. So this doesn't have actually implication of this internal kind of domestic development in the US.
And as a closing point here, from all your experience, we're in Sweden. What do we need to keep our eyes on?
I argue, in part, but we can, as just a regular citizen, you can't do anything about, for instance, things that could cause discontents, because that's national policies over the long term. For instance, the extent of inequality, that is a major cause for discontent. We cannot do anything about that. But what we can do as kind of citizens, what we can look out for, I think, mostly maybe, is polarization, and trying to keep a civilized debate and trying to respect counter-arguments to the extent that is reasonable, and try to understand each other, basically. I think that because when you stop doing that and you stop viewing this, you don't have the same perception of reality, basically. There's no point in arguing anymore. The debate just dies, and that is very dangerous.
Susanne?
Yeah, building our immunity against any populistic or fake news influence means that we need to educate ourselves more and more in that increasingly complex world with all these channels of information contradicting each other, and also losing some validity or legitimacy of some values we used to have, being questioned at least. That's much more to do, and if there is something Ukraine work inspires, there is some resilience and people really fight for some values. Is it something for us also to think how we can revitalize the values in ourselves to kind of keep being elected when this backsliding comes also in our countries?
Thank you so much, Susanna, and thank you so much, Martin. You in the audience and on the internet who have listened to us. You will find our previous talks on YouTube. And please follow us, you see the addresses here, on social media to stay ready for the next Wallenberg talk. And you will find your reports at V-Dem's homepage, and of course follow the Institute's work on your homepage as well. Thank you all for joining today.
RWT talks.
Igår så vill jag passa på att berätta att festivalen fortsätter nu här. På Kino kommer det visas film 18.30 och klockan 19 kan vi lyssna på Barnfonden nere i Böjtulshög. 19.30 här så är det Utrikespolitiska föreningen